I just want to come on and kind of just give you a peek into this brain of mine. One of the things that I have been thinking about a lot lately is I had been going to a church, and the day I started going to the church, apparently there was something going on, and the parishioners had said these people don't belong here. They're sinners. And I'm just picking, based on the sermon. But that was my first day in church, and I remember the pastor saying, it is not our job to judge. It is our job to introduce them to God and to let them develop their own relationship. And that to me was so refreshing, and that was the reason why I started going to that church. And then fast forward 2 years, and the pastor gets up in front of the congregation, and he's talking about a pastor's conference that he had just gone to, and he was talking about how he was disappointed because apparently the women in this church were really active, and he said this is not the way it's supposed to be. The men are supposed to be the spiritual leaders. And as I heard him say this, there was something in me that had a visceral body reaction to his words, because I had faced the same, and I'm just going to call it bullshit, when I was in the military. How people would say, oh, women can't be leaders, or they would make these underhanded comments about how women didn't belong in the military. And it just got me to thinking that, because people will always pull out Bible verse to justify the things that they're saying, and but I remember going to the parking lot, and I was like infuriated, because I'm like, how does a pastor stand up in front of his church that women are not supposed to be the leaders, the men are supposed to be the spiritual leaders, and I was confused about how a leader could stand up in front of his congregation and not value every member, and say that somehow, the men were the leaders because, some books or, some, and I don't mean to belittle the Bible, but guide, since I was born, I grew up Catholic, and I was raised in the church. And so this is no way demeaning the value of the Bible or the words that the Bible say. I understand that whenever it's a gospel according to anyone, a human, there is a potential for infallibility. I was military police when I was in the military, and I remember, you would show up, you'd have 10 people and 10 different accounts of what happened. And this is, and again, I know that there are people who say, the Bible is divinely inspired, but I know, like, even in the telephone game, I can get a message and it somehow get distorted. And I think that this is a message that has gotten distorted based on the time when it was written. In the time when it was written, the men were, the breadwinners, they were the person who led the family. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but what I'm asking for is for us to value what everyone brings to the table. And even when I was in the military, I used to counsel the cadets. I was the military police commander at the Air Force Academy. And the big question I would always get from them was, how do I go from being this college student to being in charge? And I would say, be very careful about what you think being in charge means. Because even as the police commander, it was, unless it was a snap decision that had to be made, on the spot, life or death, like, I rarely made a decision without counsel. I would talk to my chief, who is the senior enlisted guy in my unit. I would talk to the operations superintendent, another enlisted guy. I would talk to my operations officer. I would talk to the flight commanders. I would talk to the airmen on the ground, because my experience from the head of the organization may or may not have with the experience that was going on for the people out there doing it. And even when I look at, the family, the person who is out, being a breadwinner, who's working outside the home, who's bringing in the money, may not be in touch with what's going on at home. The person who's stay with the children, or the person who's day to day running the inner workings of the home. And I think that we bring different things to the table. We bring different considerations. This is why when they talk about peace treaties, they talk about the peace treaties where women are involved in the formation of a peace treaty. They are lasting peace treaties. And this is not to say that women are better than men. It's to say that we have a experience. There's a different part of society that we touch. And I think that when we talk about spiritual leaders, we need to be very careful about what we think that means. Does that mean that women can't be active in the church? Does it mean that women can't be pastors? Does it mean that women can't be, active leaders? No. And I was disgusted and disheartened that this was the message that my pastor was putting out to the parish, because we've spent so long trying to be equals, and sometimes things taken out of context do more harm than what they do good. And so what I'm asking for today is that we look at what everyone brings to the table. We get curious about what their lived experiences are, because sometimes when we're making decisions in a vacuum, it is not the best decision. And even a lot of people will talk about how women or wives are supposed to submit to their husbands, and I will always point to the part that says yes, and men are supposed to love their wives like Christ loved the church. So there's a relationship that goes on there, that I think sometimes we just want to subvert one person, and we want to take on leadership and take on power. And this is what I see going on in our government right now, is that we have people who don't understand their power actually means. They don't understand what being a leader actually means. It means taking care of your people, taking care of all of your people. It's like one of the things that I'm struggling with right now is, as I'm considering a congressional seat in my district is 82% white people, and the average income is seven. How do you appeal to those people? How do I make them give a shit about people who are of other colors, people who aren't making $71,000 a year, people who are homeless, people who rely on SNAP and these food stamps to feed their families? How do I make them care? And this has been a real question that I've been debating, is how do you teach people what power really means? Because there is power in having money. There is power in having, and I know people are going to push against this, but as a white person, I know that I have a different lived experience than people of color. I also realize that as a female, I have a different lived experience than my male counterparts. And I know that people don't want to hear about white privilege, but there is privilege, things that we don't have to face, that people of color do, or that women do, or that women of color do. There are differences in that lived experience. And so what I'm encouraging today is for us to look into, where do I hold power? And how am I leading, the people under me? How am I leading my household? How am I co-leading my household? How am I honoring the person that I have chosen to co-lead with? And to really use our power to come together, to really care about everyone underneath our home. And I'm going to use the word home very broadly because I think when we talk about home, home is our neighborhoods, home is our cities, home is our states, home is our countries. And I'll be honest, coming home after retiring from the military, it made me extremely sad, because home doesn't feel like home. We don't feel like neighbors. It doesn't feel like a United States. And so today the invitation is look at your power. How are you using your power, and how can we love each other better?